A default argument is basically an argument that's passed automatically when you call a function call. And so an example of that would be, let's say that we have a void function that calculates the area. And so to calculate the area, we need the length and the width. So this function is going to have a double and another double. Well, let's say that we want some default arguments in this. So what we can do is we can put something in this. So this would be our function prototype. We can say double is equal to 20, and this double is equal to 10. And so basically what we're doing, and this is the length and the width. So basically what we're doing is we're giving this function some default arguments so someone can call it without providing arguments, and it'll automatically use the 20 and the 10 for those values. This is with the function prototype. You can also define these in your function definition if you're not using prototypes. So you put your default arguments in whichever one comes first, whether it's the prototype or the definition. So if you're putting this in the function definition, this would be, or the header, this would be void show area double, length is equal to 20, and double width is equal to 10. So either one of these will work. You just put your default arguments in whichever one comes first in your program. And so the way that you would call this, the way that you can call this function, since it has the default arguments in it, is you can just do show area and not send it any arguments, and then it will just use the default arguments, which are 20 and 10. So then it's like, okay, well, why would you want to, like, what's the point of having a function that you can send an argument into if it has these default arguments? Well, this is kind of nice because it makes it so, like, we can call the function like this. Like, let's say we have some functions that one of the parameters is almost always a certain value, but then sometimes it's different. So we can use default arguments to use the values that it almost always is, but then we can override those values with the function call. Like, let's say that our length is actually 12 and not 20, so we can call this function like this, and this is going to override the length. So now length is going to be equal to 20, but it's still going to have the default argument for the width. So the length is going to be 12 and the width will be 10. You can also override both. So you can do show area and then send it 12 and maybe 5.5. So you can override one or both. The only thing with this is you can't do this. So you can't say show area, leave the first one blank, and then try and override the second one. So you can't do this. If you leave one argument out, you have to leave all the others out after that one's left out. Parameters with default arguments must be defined last. So, well, let's say, so another thing you can do is, like, let's say that we only have sum with default arguments. We could do like int get sum, and then let's say we don't want a default argument on this first one, but then we have int is equal to 0, int is equal to 0 for two of our arguments. This is fine, but you wouldn't be able to do this. So int get sum, int equals 0, int. So this one isn't okay. And the reason why is because then when you call this function, let's just look at how we would call these. So get sum. So we need to provide a parameter for this int because it doesn't have one. So let's just give it a 2. And then the second two arguments, or these second two parameters have default arguments, so theoretically we could call this function like this, and then it would get the 2, and then it has the 0 and the 0 for the other two variables. Or we could call it like this, so get some, and let's say we want to override the second one with a 2, but then we still want the third variable to be 0. So we can do that, or we can override, like we need to send it the first argument because it doesn't have a default argument for the first one, but then we can override the second two default arguments. So let's say that we just want to send it all 2s. But then if we look at this one that we can't we can't do our default variables like this, and the reason why is because if we call this function, let's say we have the get sum, we need to provide an argument for this first parameter because it doesn't have one, so we'd give it a 2, and then we have like a default argument there, so theoretically we don't need to provide it with anything. But the problem is this last parameter needs an argument because it doesn't have a default argument. So we can't do this. Like we can't do that. You'd get a compilation error. So the only way to call this function would be to send it always send it an argument for the second parameter, even though we have a default argument there. So you'd have to always call it like this if you want that to be 0. And so it kind of defeats the purpose of having the default argument.